Welcome to the next episode of Navigating Carbon, your compass to carbon management. As always, I'm your host, Deb Ryan. And in this episode, I sat down with Mark Mersman and we do a deep dive on carbon credits, specifically those generated from orphan oil and gas wells. Mark is an industry leader in the carbon market space, and he recently joined Sandora ESG as a senior advisor for carbon management and sustainability. Mark shares some of his expertise on the challenges as well as the nuance of generating carbon credits from plugging and abandoning orphan oil and gas wells, as well as some of the risks associated with this kind of work and what is potentially being done to mitigate some of these risks. If you enjoy our conversation, please make sure you like the podcast. And as always, hit that subscribe button to make sure you stay on top of all upcoming episodes. But for now, sit back and enjoy my conversation with Mark. Hey, everybody, and welcome to the next episode of the Navigating Carbon podcast. Today, I'm really excited to have a conversation about a really important topic on orphan wells and carbon credits. And to do that, I'm joined by Mark Mersman. Mark, how are you? It's so good to have you.
Doing great, Deb. Excited to be here. Excited about the topic and share what is
Yeah.
freshly off of the third annual AAPG Orphan Well Conference. So I should have
Which is
some
awesome.
timely updates. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a market that is definitely starting to get a lot of attention and is growing. And so I'm really excited to dive in and sort of pull it apart and get sort of deep into some of the challenges and opportunities in this space. So like you work for a company called Sandora ESG. Can you explain what you're doing there and what they're doing in the market in this kind of space?
Yeah, you bet. Sendero is a family of companies actually that were founded by a couple of principals who've been operating either drilling operations or P&A operations, oil field service operations for about 40 years out in the Permian Basin. So a very established company. And the last 15 years, they've been focusing a little bit more on the P&A. And just in the last year, early of 2024, spring of 24, they hired David Stewart and brought him into Sendero to stand up the ESG company with a focus on compliance. So this big wave of Quad OB regulations that are coming towards operators that have not historically had to deal with these reporting regulations and requirements that are now in place and likely will stay in place. How do we help them navigate that to avoid those penalties and start making sure that they're really optimizing their carbon intensity and the footprint? And that's where I joined just about 4 months ago to really help with the carbon management and share ideas with different operators who are needing to address their methane emissions footprint. And what we can share with operators is they look through a schedule of plugging that they might have. We can help them look at what wells might qualify for some of these newly emerging carbon credits that can help that operator subsidize or maybe even completely pay for the cost of plugging a well that they might want to get plugged. So we can dig into that a little bit more, but the
Yeah.
ESG side of Sendero was set up within the last year to really focus on how to help the operating and community navigate these waves of emissions type regulations.
And I love what you're doing because this idea of carbon management, which is something that I know you and I have talked about a lot and something I'm very passionate about. It's not just companies trying to just deal with regulations and what they've got to do, but really looking for the opportunities and like how do they, optimize their schedules and look at things like, where they can actually get money back for different activities and things like that as well. So it's a really cool thing that you guys are doing in this space. So
It's
I
promising.
love
It's
it.
early. It's early,
Right?
but yeah, it's very
It
promising.
is early, but it's a conversation that's coming up more and more, which is really great. And so like when we talk about orphaned wells or plugging and abandoning or P&A, cleaning wells, like what are we talking about in terms of size? I know you said you're focused on the Permian Basin, like just for folks that aren't aware of like the size and scale of what we mean when we're talking about this, like can you give us some sort of indication of that?
It's kind of alarming. So a number of different studies have been done by the EPA and Environmental Defense Fund and other entities looking at different segments of the well. So what we're really addressing is the later life well and what happens with that well later in its production life. And what we have from an order of magnitude from a production, we have a marginal well that's producing maybe no more than 20 barrels a day. So a real small producer. that makes up a very significant portion of all operating wells in the United States, but a very small proportion of the amount of hydrocarbons produced. So it's an outsized impact on the industry from a methane and an environmental impact perspective. And that's where we're focused on that as much as anything, because that's where we think we can help the operator avoid challenges and us as citizens avoid more wells going onto the orphan well list. So after a marginal well is no longer really working for an operator so well, they'll idle that well or in that well. So that's a whole nother category of wells that are out there in inventories of solvent operators right now. And depending on the jurisdiction statewide, whether or not they have to plug that well if it's been idled for 2 years or 5 years, or can they do different things to continue to delay the requirement to plug that well, that happens a lot. And there are estimates of upwards of a couple million wells that are in this idled status. And then if you throw orphan wells, which is that idled well that had an operator attached to it, if there are challenges for that operator and they go away, go bankrupt, oftentimes those wells go on to the orphan well list for a state. So now you and I, as residents of Colorado or Texas or wherever, we've got a fund that the state has set up to try to pay for plugging those orphan wells, but it's not enough money. And therein lies the opportunity. There's this real big challenge. We've got upwards of 3 million wells in the United States that probably need to be plugged. And many of them are emitting. And how do we get those plugged if we don't have the coffers full enough from a state perspective? And more to the point, for operators that are operating marginal wells, their economics are dramatically different than a major or super major. And how do we help them account for that needed capital to get these wells plugged so that they don't get into further penalties and that they don't end up having to walk away from it and leaving it orphaned? So that's the real core of the challenge that we're facing. How do we help operators really take this challenge of compliance and maybe flip it on its head and present an opportunity at least to get more done with less operating capital? So.
Yeah. And I think, the size and scale that you just outlined, I think for people, I think it's a really important piece because it is a huge problem, like across the country, as different areas have gone up and down in favorability and production over more than 100 years. So you mentioned, looking at leaks and things like that, and you mentioned methane. We've talked a lot about methane on the podcast and things like that, but is it just methane that companies are having to deal with from these old, idled, orphaned, wells?
It's a great question. It is what is isolated as a molecule to target relating to regulations. So the oil and gas industry is now being forced to look at methane emissions specifically more so than they have. But the challenge from an orphaned well is beyond methane. So you have all the VOCs. And what we also see is that there are in areas some really high benzene concentrations that are emitting from the well. And historically just not even looked for that. And then groundwater contamination and things of that nature are where just this week, Adam Peltz with Environmental Defense Fund and others in the space looking at this, were really focused on that this is beyond methane. We need to be plugging these wells because many times it's a groundwater issue. And that downhole, there's such integrity issues that we're contaminating groundwater for our communities. So that's a challenge because there aren't really the credits to monetize in the same way there yet. Environmental attribute credits are coming, and we can surely dive into that too because it seems to be really emerging and getting a lot of attention. And it'll tie right back into, there is a renewed focus, I think, across the globe for what are categorically super polluter emitters or emittents, which are methane. That's categorically one. But it's also like CFCs from refrigerators and things of that nature, where there is this outsized impact where one molecule of a CFC is hundreds of times more potent than CO2. And that's where methane has this multiplier too. I could actually share a screen that kind of identifies
pop that up for us.
Interest. Get there real quick. This was from a Trellis presentation and Rubicon Carbon. put this slide
Okay.
together. So this was a webcast just in the last couple of weeks, and it was talking about super pollutants. And what we see is that here's methane. This is a 100-year time frame of the impact of carbon dioxide relative to CO2e. And what we see
Which,
is
if
that
folks could see that, that's that tiny little blue line
it's
on your chart
let me
looking
see
at
that.
that
It's
time
like
frame.
28 times more impactful than
Yep.
CO2, excuse me.
Yep.
Nitrous oxide, interestingly enough, used in all kinds of applications, has 265 times more impact than carbon dioxide on our atmosphere's heating potential. And that's what all this is geared towards. What's the global warming potential of a particular molecule? And why methane is so interesting from a carbon credit development is that it's so pervasive in the upstream market and is a pretty significant multiplier on CO2e. So every ton of methane that we can avoid, it's effectively 26 tons of CO2e that we're avoiding, and that's an important factor.
It's pretty incredible. And so, like, as we think about generating carbon credits, and you mentioned for some of the things like the other, like the water and stuff like that, that's not quite there. But like, can you talk us through, how would someone go about generating a carbon credit from plugging an old well? Like, how does that even work? Like,
Yeah,
that would be
that's good.
great.
So there are in the voluntary carbon markets, and this is there's a lot of layers to this, so it gets kind of complicated in the carbon market space, as you're well aware. I'm sure your audience is well aware. So what we're talking about is the voluntary carbon market, not the compliance market, regulated in no way at all. It's voluntary, so it's kind of the Wild West. And within that marketplace, there have been historically a number of different methodologies that we're all familiar with and have heard horror stories about that are forestation and reforestation, where we sequester carbon in a grove of 1,000 acres of trees. Those are carbon credits, and they're monitoring how much carbon is sunk into that forest and then given a number to that. There's a number of different types of methodologies that focus on mitigation outcomes and whether or not we are removing carbon from the atmosphere or avoiding the emission of carbon into the atmosphere? Are we a systems type approach to where it could be engineered and we are actually in a materials application where Portland cement emits 1 ton of CO2e for every ton of Portland cement, but gosh, there's new materials coming out and we can reduce that carbon intensity. You can monetize that credit, and it's more of an engineered type carbon credit or a deterministic credit. The orphan wells are the first methodology that was put into the market by American Carbon Registry about 3-4 years ago. They had this methodology start being developed. And a company by the name of Well Done, it's a foundation actually, Well Done Foundation, Curtis Schuck, was helping ACR develop this methodology. And it really was a function of, hey, here's an orphan well. It has no controls on it. It's literally just out in a field or in a swamp area, and it's just emitting free flow into the
Wow.
atmosphere. And it's that where the focus comes in like, oh my gosh, what are we doing to stop that? There's no funds in the orphan well funds for the states to get to all those problem wells. What can we do? And that's where Well Done and ACR developed this methodology. Let's quantify that emission rate and then plug it and show that that emission rate was stopped. And by doing that, that's very scientifically based. With that, we can really come to a much more deterministic amount of avoided methane, and that is our mitigation outcome. And then, okay, how many years of emissions would that well have continued to spew if we hadn't plugged it today? Well, the market doesn't know. Nobody knows. We've kind of made this up. And right now we're kind of looking at, somewhere between 10 and 20 years. There are now 6 different methodologies.
Oh,
So
wow.
there's different variations. I'm talking about the very first one that we had. It's ACR's orphan well methodology. They'll give a 20-year multiple on that 1 year of methane at 100-year global warming potential on the methane. So they'll multiply. If we had 1 ton every year, we'd have 20 tons over 20 years. And then we'd multiply that times 26. And that would be the amount of methane mitigated. That is a 1 ton CO2 carbon credit that could be
Okay.
used to offset. So
Very
there's a lot.
cool.
There's a lot.
No,
But
I appreciate that. And I think it's really important for those that aren't as familiar with oil and gas operations as well. Like you mentioned the materials piece of it. So, to essentially, plug these old wells and fix, the integrity of the steel casing, for the most part, we use cement, like you said. And like cement is one of the highest carbon emitting
Yeah.
products that we have along with steel and other things. So like talk a little bit about some of the materials piece. You mentioned that really briefly, but I think it's really worth diving into because there has been a lot of development in cement and like what does that actually mean in terms of reducing the carbon intensity of creating that kind of product?
Yeah, it's really, really interesting space, and a tremendous amount of attention is being given to it. Uh, some estimates we've seen, it's about 8% of global CO2 emissions are contributed to the development of Portland cement. So it is one of the top five biggest emitters as an industry. And the numbers are about 1 to 1. So 1 ton of Portland cement actually emits about 1 ton of CO2e on a real loose basis. You got to put transportation into it, all kinds of other stuff. But using that as a baseline, there are materials now that are actually being pursued. I'm part of a group that has been fortunate enough to win a grant just in January from the Louisiana Fuel opportunity. It's a DOE sponsored grant for different transitionary type technology and ideas within the energy industry. So we've been working with Louisiana Tech for about 4 years on a geopolymer, which is using industry byproduct and not a heat process. And it's using these already have emitted their carbon. So they're a really low carbon intensity material by the time we're getting them. And we are seeing in those numbers that you can have materials that have better attributes for downhole applications in particular. That's what we're focused on. Better
Yeah.
heat resistance, better corrosivity, better resistance to corrosive environments, better adherence to steel, and up to 75% less carbon intensive than Portland cement.
That's amazing.
Schlumberger just, I think it was January, February of 24, announced that they had used a geopolymer out in the Permian Basin, isolating a few zones for Pioneer Resources. And they were speaking to the benefits of it in light of carbon reduction and that it kind of needs to be a localized production. So it's a community focused opportunity. And with Louisiana Tech and what we've been working on with that, we're really excited about it. So this grant is
Yeah.
it's a proof of concept, and it's showing downhole applications will drill out the core. And just we've got to meet a lot of criteria to be allowed in a well bore for plugging. But we're 3 years into it and excited about where that goes. And the industry is very much running at this to try to figure out how
Yeah.
to green cements and other things that aren't quite working so well. And that's where everybody's trying to figure out the answer. Huge
I love
opportunity.
that. Yeah. And so we've talked a lot about like the literal mechanics as well as like the mechanics of generating a credit and stuff. I want to talk about some of the like more macro kind of pieces of this. So like when we're talking about generating these credits, obviously then, what kind of demand are you guys seeing for these kind of credits from buyers of carbon credits looking to offset their emissions? Is that been increasing or really where's the noise around that?
Yeah, it's emerging. It's such a new idea. I mean, we're really only about 4 years into the idea of getting a credit from plugging a well. Huh.
Yeah.
And then there's these variations of it. So there's a lot of options that a buyer can review, and that's confusing. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
education that's been happening and still needs to happen, frankly. We have seen trades occur, so we know that these credits are selling. And don't hold me to the numbers, but as of the end of 2024, there had only been 7 projects that had been completed. So it's all very, very new. I think already this year, we're close to almost that number, if not more, already in the books or about to hit the books. So the
And
growth
just
on
relatively, we're only sitting here in February. So that's like,
it's
that
really,
acceleration's pretty, even if the numbers are slightly
it's
off, that
pretty
acceleration's real.
hyperbolic.
That's cool.
It's
Yeah.
very much so. The challenge with it is, frankly, is that the buyers aren't quite there yet. We do have some public announcements. So Workday, very large SaaS company that does HR benefits and things, announced publicly that they had bought credits through Tradewater. And those credits were credits from plugging orphan wells using that ACR methodology. So that's one public announcement. There's been a few quiet ones. We know Northern Trust is a company that's starting to look at these types of credits. And then there's other bigger industry players. Blockchain for Energy is out in the space, certainly helping super majors with how do we look at just carbon accounting at large and just emissions reductions and things of that nature. And along with other commodities platforms that have expressed interest to us. And actually been advising for a couple of other companies that are in the insurance space and other things related to carbon credits. And there's some great interest and real demand, it seems, that's building. One of the challenges is the differentiation across the platforms, the methodologies that we know as an industry. And that was part of the conversations this week. We need standardization towards that. Insurance was mentioned. There's a Well Done now is offering insurance on their carbon credits. So we see that as one of those attributes that can really remove the friction from the buyers. Like, where are the holes? What's the challenge? And
Yeah, like let's break that down a little bit because we have seen a lot of hesitation in the carbon markets with people, and when I say people, companies buying credits and being part of that. Can you explain for folks how the insurance helps with that and what you're seeing developing in this space around it? Because I think it's a really interesting, everyone's so worried about risk, right? And
that's huge,
this
huge
is where
piece.
this flows in. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's on the heels of the Vera, the Red Plus type carbon credits that are tied to forestry, where there's issues, there's challenges there, and there isn't the same level of integrity. So as these other engineered type credits. And what we've seen in the marketplace over the last 2 years, after some of these bigger challenges, is that there is this focus much more towards that credibility piece and the transparency piece. So it's all in the effort of really mitigating as much risk as we can. Okay, where is there still a lot of risk? Well, delivery risk is a big issue that an investor wants to address. So oftentimes these credit projects will be pre-funded, where we need the capital to actually execute on the project that will develop this many carbon credits. So that investor historically has gone into that relationship just on a personal guarantee or something of that nature. Now there's insurance available from KEDA and OCA. They've been the leaders in getting out there in the carbon markets to provide some kind of a basis. More often than not, they're very specific though, and that's been the part of the challenge. There's a regulatory risk insurance where if the regulations change and it really avoids the additionality of a credit, okay, here's some insurance and can cover that loss. And what we're seeing the industry try to focus on is getting much more focused on details and how do we really tighten up that risk that we are experiencing in the credit markets. And I think there's other companies that are exploring ways to do that, with insurance being the critical piece for an investor. I know that if I put money in and something happens, whether it's an integrity issue or an encroachment issue where we didn't think anybody be drilling in this area and now here comes a well, so it removes some of those credits, right? It reverses some of those. So we can get to a lot more data supporting and addressing the various risks with IoT now, and that's really exciting. Okay. We can see technology kind of coming into this. The insurance industry and upstream oil and gas has been around forever. We've been insuring downhole and blowout risks forever, or quite a long time. So technology is advancing that a lot too, to really reduce that risk, and that we can see what's happening as it's happening in real time and prevent some of those risks that we hadn't been able to prevent before. So
that's really great. Yeah, really cool developments in this space. And I think, like you framed out at the beginning, this is such a huge problem, even just here in the US, never mind in other parts of the world. And so, yeah, it's really cool to kind of dive in. So I'm curious as we wrap up, like, what are you excited about in this space? Like, where do you think it's heading? Like, what's coming down the pipeline? Like, yeah, what gets you up in the morning to get you all excited about this?
Yeah, various things. So I'm entrepreneurial, so I am a part of a few different teams doing things. And the methane detection piece is exciting. We've got some provisional IP on that. Like, what do we do with these wells after we plugged them? How do we know they stay plugged? That's a huge issue. What happens in the soil around a wellbore after we plug it? We don't know any of that. So it's just an interesting science project in a sense to pursue that, but it's also then giving this information and critical information to the insurers or the buyers of a carbon credit that we know once we plugged it, it stayed plugged for the 20 years. So that's one piece. The materials piece is having some other offshore infrastructure opportunities as well as downhole applications for reduced carbon materials. That's really exciting. And then more specifically to the orphan well and marginal well. It is a function of education. The more we educate the marketplace, the more bigger buyers that we're starting to see with an interest in these types of credits. And I think the larger global interest in super polluter emissions, that I think by nature of Article 6.4 and what are now these internationally transferable mitigation outcomes, that within the next couple of years, there's I believe, an ability to have a very common methodology. Maybe it's not standardized per se, but that'd be the ideal thing that allows anybody and everybody to get out there and develop one of these credits. And if you go through the right process, you have insurance that the market can adopt. And wow, we're hitting on one of the more impactful things, and that is avoiding methane emissions. And upstream market is just ripe for that. Then there's also compliance credits likely really coming more into the market and addressing the additionality issue so that we might actually help marginal operators put in a vapor recovery unit or a new thief hatch that dramatically reduces that site level emission rate. But they don't have the money to do that necessarily. But if we could monetize that reduction in emission rate and quantify that, which we can now, and if we could get a credit for that or some kind of an environmental attribute, so there's companies like Earn.dlt and others that have created these types of tokenized environmental attributes, I think that it's had challenges with market timing, I think, but it feels like the idea of environmental attributes with a larger impact even on groundwater and things of that nature, those are likely to become a real market that have money tied to some measure of unit improvement or reduction, and
Very cool.
all of those things kind of get me excited because I think it all helps
I
the
think,
industry.
and it's such a, and I know you and I have talked about this before, but there's so many different players, and you've mentioned some of them who I've had on the podcast and I know quite well and things like that. And I think the thing that's really interesting to me in this space is it's going to be like all these collaborations and everyone kind of working together and finding sort of standardization and stuff so that the rules of the game are understood so that it can scale essentially, which
Absolutely.
is pretty cool. But I know there's a lot of conversations around that right now, which is good to see, which
It
is
is.
awesome.
And bigger and
So,
bigger players are coming into that
mhm,
conversation. That's
yeah,
very exciting.
which
There
is
was
great.
a platform, a brokerage firm that was at this AAPG Orphan Well conference this year. So that's the first time they've ever attended, and
Yeah,
anyone like that attend. So that's super exciting to see that. Oh wait, there's a platform that's starting to broker these types of credits,
yeah.
and it's coming. Yeah,
And I love the other piece that I really love about that is that we're starting to see some cross pollination of all these different groups. It's not just the technical folks or the finance folks or the carbon folks, but
right.
how do we get everyone in one room
In
to
that
try
same
and work
direction.
together and solve
Awesome.
these problems, which is awesome to hear. So I love
Yeah.
it.
Well, appreciate you
Cool.
give everybody a voice to do that. So thank you, Deb. Yeah.
So yeah, no, Mark, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate it, and we'll have to have you back on in like a year's time and hear about all the different updates in all the different spaces and things that are going on because there's a lot of movement. There's some cool things happening. So yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.